Dr. Malama Tsimenis, whom I will introduce very briefly, who comes to us from the University of Toronto, Scarborough. And Dr. Malama Tsimenis holds a PhD in 19th century French literature from the University of Montréal. Since 2004, she has been teaching at the University of Toronto, Scarborough, where she has been recognized for her commitment to undergraduate teaching through various awards and nominations. Dr. Tsimenis gives seminars and leads workshops on pedagogical issues to both faculty and graduate students, and works closely with teaching assistants both as a mentor and as a coordinator for language courses. Her research interests lay in literary criticism, prefatory discourse, aesthetic theory, and innovative pedagogy. In the past 4 years, she has been conducting research on the impact of experiential learning and education on students' engagement and students' learning, and more specifically on the pedagogical model of academic service learning, an interest that both of us share very dearly. Please welcome Professor.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. Thank you for this warm welcome. It's a pleasure to be here again, because I was here 2 years ago as well. My talk today is entitled Peer and Self-Assessment in the Second Language Classroom, Empowering Students to Gain Ownership of Their Learning. I would like to start with a few facts. For all of us who are gathered here today in our capacity as language teachers or language learners, the value and the importance of what we do is clear and obvious. We know that teaching a second language means so much more than teaching our students the use of the subjunctive or l'accord du participe passé. We know that through our teaching, we transmit and promote the value of intercultural communication, the importance of building bridges with our local and larger communities. We know that through the teaching of language, we expose our students to different ways of thinking and viewing the world. But it's becoming more and more obvious to me that the value of what we do doesn't seem as really valuable to the outer world, let's say, except maybe for accreditation. As teachers of language, literature, culture, what we do is often considered as non-practical in the sense that it doesn't lead necessarily to a career or a well-paid job. For example, I don't know if you've ever attended the Ontario University Fairs every year, this big annual event where students and parents come to ask us professors, the teachers, about what their children should do in the future. 95% of parents and students ask me, and I'm the wrong person to ask, how will I become a lawyer, a doctor, an engineer? I don't know. I'm teaching languages and literature and culture. Are you interested in that? No, not so much. So this is a general feeling that I get lately more and more. But unfortunately, it's not just the outer world. Even within our institutions, for example, let's say funding opportunities for departments of language compared to other disciplines that are more vocational. Or even something that's very close to home, since I'm from UT Scarborough. Very recently, the beginners, the introductory language courses were eliminated from the program because the vision of the administration was that they don't lead to something tangible. They're not part of a program, of a degree, of a major, of a specialist. So why keep them? If they don't lead to a specific degree, why keep them? Why bother? This year they were brought back again, but only as service courses to management students who are, again, by their discipline, required to take a language course. So there's this pursuit of specialization, this pursuit of professional specialization that has led, to my opinion, to another sad reality. The student is consumer phenomenon. Students, I see more and more, approach their learning with the mentality of consumers. They see education as a product to be sold in exchange for money. And very often they come into university thinking that That's what they do when they pay their tuition fees. They're exchanging their money for knowledge. But this mentality sets standards and expectations that do not comply with the spirit of a broad, of a meaningful education, or with the quality of the educational experience that we as teachers want to offer to our students. Don't tell me, for example, that you've never been approached by students who demand or expect a passing grade just because they've paid their tuition fees, right? Where does it lead us? We see students that often, are disengaged. We have poor classroom participation, poor academic performance, diminished attention. So in other words, students who seem to lack an intrinsic motivation, who do not feel responsible for the learning. But maybe appearances are deceiving. On one hand, we are faced with what we perceive to be a lack of engagement, but on the other hand, and there I think lies the contrast that we need to look at more closely, we have the students' voice through surveys, for example, who are basically telling us that they are enthusiastic about the potentials of education. They do expect a lot out of their university experience. And when asked to identify the attributes that would enhance both this engagement aspect and the quality of their learning experience in general, students never fail to stress the long-term effects of authentic, meaningful, and life-changing experiences that different types of interaction have had on them. These types of interaction are promoted through the benchmarks of effective educational practice, as described in the National Survey for Student Engagement, and these are the results for 2 years back. This is a survey to all university students in North America, and it's every 2 years. So the last results show that students, in order for them to be engaged in their learning, want active and collaborative learning. This can include peer instruction, peer mentoring, peer assessment, meaningful student-faculty interaction, both inside the classroom and outside of the classroom, enriching educational experiences that can range from the use of technology that promotes exchange and collaboration among students to more active engagement with the larger community through, for example, volunteer opportunities or service learning courses. So I think that maybe it would be fair, to comme on dit en français, couper la poire en deux. To say that maybe it's not motivation that our students lack. Maybe what they lack is the tools to transform this motivation into a more meaningful and personal engagement with their learning. So in other words, maybe they're just seeking for opportunities to creatively channel and express this motivation. And my presentation today will focus on strategies that promote such opportunities, which hopefully empower students by helping them to gain ownership of and responsibility for their learning. But if you can please allow me to start with explaining why I chose to talk about this. It's something that I have struggled with throughout the years, and my entire teaching, philosophy, and practice have been shaped around this struggle. And when I say struggle, I don't mean I'm fighting with someone. It's just a tension between two contradictory attitudes. One I had as a learner myself, and one I adopted when I crossed this limit and I came from the other side of the bench. So more specifically, the teachers that I personally, as a learner, looked up to the most, and that I feel I benefited from the most, were those teachers whose role had became progressively secondary and ultimately strictly supportive, allowing me space to build my own confidence and to become an autonomous learner. When I became a teacher now myself, and this is actually one of the things that I regret the most when I look back at the first years, particularly of my teaching, is that I did not do enough on my part to make students realize the extent to which they are responsible for their learning. So I felt entirely responsible for maybe, their poor performance, slow progress, sometimes their failures, as if they had no responsibility for this at all. So as a result, I have to say that even though my goal was ultimately to help them improve and gain confidence in themselves and their learning abilities, I tried to meet this goal mainly by assuming the entire burden of this responsibility, by preparing, for instance, extra handouts, by planning for extra review sessions, extra office hours, just to give this support to students who was coming all from me. A few years back, I attended, gladly, an instructional skill workshops at Ryerson. And the facilitator of the workshop asked us to reflect in groups on a few quotations. And this was one of them. If the student hasn't learned, the teacher hasn't taught. So this inspired me to reflect on this issue more deeply. And recently, I have experimented with teaching tools that have helped me to gradually free myself from this idea and to help students take ownership of their learning. So how can we do that? In my opinion, is by trying to share the burden with the students themselves, to help them become more in control, for example, by giving them a voice, so by involving them in the learning process. How can we involve them, for example? For example, in the design of the curriculum. Very often I ask my students to contribute to the design of the curriculum by proposing themselves reading discussion topics that are of an interest to them, and we can go from there. Also, recently, I tried to include students even in the design of what I call behavior guidelines in the classroom. You know, sometimes disruptive behavior can be a problem in our classes, and it's not definitely something that enhances the student experience. So the first day of class, the students worked in groups to elaborate those behavior guidelines based on previous bad experiences they had in other courses, and they came up with this. So this became our contract. So this was first-year students, so coming directly from high school. And that's what the students came up with as a contract. So students will not engage in any type of disruptive behavior. They will not arrive in class late, will not use cell phones, will turn off the cell phones. So those are all things that students came up with. I did not influence them whatsoever. They knew what uncivil behavior was, and they worked together to prepare this contract that if they did not comply with, they would lose participation grades. That's the input of the professor. I was the terrorist of the grades. So this is something that they prepared themselves. So today I will focus on one aspect of such empowering strategies is assessment. So both self-assessment and peer assessment. We all know the importance of assessment. We all know how important assessment is. It is an integral part of the educational experience of the instruction. It provides diagnostic feedback, helps us set standards. For example, what performance demonstrates simply understanding or knowledge or mastery. It evaluates progress. It can relate to a student's progress and motivates performance. Especially for, I'm sure we all do our self-evaluation. So we're asking questions to ourselves like, what is working for my students? What is not working? What can I do to help the students more? In what direction should I go next? And students should be asking those questions or similar questions about themselves instead of just waiting for us to ask these questions on their behalf. So I will share with you how I have incorporated assessment in my teaching as a way to encourage students to ask these questions. First of all, I will start with self-assessment. I don't know if you have ever surfed the website of Carnegie Mellon. They have an excellent teaching center. And I was inspired by the exam wrappers, what they call. It's a kind of a tool, of a self-assessment tool, that at least it helped me greatly in my efforts to help students take responsibility for the learning. So I decided to experiment with this concept first in 2009, and I keep doing this every year from now because this is an eye-opener for students. So I engaged my BO1, FRE BO1, this is an intermediate class, students in a two-part self-assessment exercise. And this was the adaptation from the exam wrappers, because they don't have a two-part, it's only one-fold. So after a test, they take back their grades and the test, and they come complaining, okay, to me. So I prepared this sheet with specific targeted questions that students had to answer. So they had to go over their graded tests and answer these questionnaires that basically ask them to analyze and explain the nature of their mistakes, identify their own areas of weaknesses, and suggest study strategies that would help them to improve. And just to give you an idea of what this was. So this is part one. This is back in October 2009. So please answer the following questions honestly. Do not write down your name. I didn't want to assess them on this. It was for themselves that were doing it. So the answers were not graded. This is just to help them reflect on their performance and the effectiveness of their exam preparation. And this chapter was on passé composé imparfait. For those of you who have taught in French, passé composé imparfait, this is a huge problem for students. Oh, yes, yeah. So, for example, approximately how much time did you spend preparing for this test? What percentage of your test preparation was spent in each of these activities? Now that you have looked over your graded exam, estimate the percentage of points you lost due to each of the following, okay? Trouble understanding, memorizing, spelling mistakes, careless mistakes, other. Name at least two things that you plan to do differently in preparing for the next text. So now the burden goes a little bit on them. What are you going to do to be better prepared for the future? And then there's question 7. What can I do to help you better prepare for the upcoming test? So after a few weeks, there's a second test and a second grading part. So I tallied all the answers of my students from this first part, so what I could have done better, and I addressed all of their demands. Everything they asked for, I did. So for the second post-test reflection, question 5 reads, after reviewing your comments from the first post-test reflection, I did the following to help you to better prepare for this test. I posted web-based exercises on the course website based on the material which you would be tested on. Extra exercises, they're correcting the correct answers on the course website. Extra translation exercises, we corrected all the translations in class. I held a review session, and you knew the exact format of the test early on. So given this, if you did not do as well as you would have liked to on this test, why do you think this is? Or what do you need to do to become more efficient? So this showed students that I took what they said to heart. I took it seriously. I did not dismiss what they said. But it also taught them a valuable lesson, okay? Especially to those who did even more poorly in the second test. That no matter what an instructor does to help them, it's ultimately up to them to take ownership of their learning, and given the material that it's available to them, they have to develop their own strategies to adequately prepare for such types of assessment. Self-assessment through peer instruction using audience response systems. I don't know if you're familiar with the audience response systems. It's just a fancy word to say iClicker. And if you've ever watched Who Wants to Be a Millionaire, it's this device that the audience holds to give answers when the person doesn't know the answer. The clicker is this handheld device that allows students to vote by clicking on the appropriate button of their choice. So on the clicker, there's A, B, C, D. For my part, so the instructor uses a receiver. It's just a very small box, easy to transport, that collects all the votes sent by students. So instructors present a question and enable the polling. Each student has to respond by clicking the appropriate button for his or her choice, and then a wireless signal is sent immediately to the receiver, and I can make the students see exactly with graphs on the PowerPoint what percentage got what answer right. Okay. So the way I chose to use this tool is in a more interactive way, because clicking can be a very solitary activity. There's no learning there. There's no learning when you just try to click the answer. So I display the question, and I use a lot those iClickers in my classrooms. So I display the question. I give students an X amount of time to discuss it. So here is where the actual learning happens. They talk to each other, they go back to their book, they go back to their notes, they try to reiterate the material and try to explain to one another why this is the right answer, no, this is the right answer. So there's teaching happening, peer teaching. And what I've done after a few weeks of trial is I don't give students one clicker each, I want them to share the clicker. So they discuss the right answer, they're engaged in this peer teaching activity, and then there's only one vote per group, if you want. So they're seeing that are able to teach each other. And at the same time, this peer teaching is an effective way and a good opportunity for self-assessment, because the results of their voting also are immediately visible. For my part, I have a prompt and accurate picture of what causes a problem, so I can go through this material again with them. But at the same time, it allows the students to assess their own understanding of the material in comparison to their classmates, while at the same time avoiding embarrassment, because the whole process is anonymous. This has helped students a lot, at least that's what their comments are in their evaluations. I would like to talk a little bit longer about peer assessment, because this can be trickier. It's good to assess yourself, okay? But how can you assess the other, especially if you're at the same level? I incorporated peer assessment in an advanced French oral course that I've been teaching for the past 4 years now. It's an advanced oral course, and I teach it as a service learning course. I don't know if you're familiar with service learning. Henri before was talking about experiential education. Is one pedagogical model of experiential education. It's a course-based, credit-bearing educational experience that allows students to participate in an organized service activity that meets identified community needs, and at the same time to reflect on this activity in such a way as to gain insights, further understanding of the course content, a broader appreciation of the discipline, and an enhanced sense of civic responsibility. So it's, let's say, in the spectrum of educational experiences, we would have volunteerism on one part, where the main beneficiary, let's say, would be the clients of the agency for whom the students would volunteer for. At the other part of the spectrum, we would have practicums or internships, where the main goal is, yes, of course, to provide service to the community, but the main goal and the main beneficiary is the student, who is supposed through this service to gain skills, important skills for their future profession. Okay, so service learning is exactly in the middle of this. Students learn about course material, the problematique, the problems and the ideas of the course, while at the same time they provide service for the community. But it's the community who has identified the needs of its clients. So it's somewhere in between. So a big part, so just to give you an idea, the objectives for my course are, of course, all the traditional objectives that you see here that any advanced French or language course, for that matter, we had. Okay, improve students' pronunciation, expand their vocabulary, the spontaneity of the way they speak. But at the same time, through incorporating this service learning, I also wanted to raise students' awareness on the complexity and the importance of language as a carrier of culture, help them realize the degree to which they can act as agents or facilitators of cultural communication and social change, thanks to the acquisition of a second language. Help them to develop a greater appreciation and capacity for intercultural communication, a deeper understanding of the social-cultural dynamics of their community, and an opportunity to take a critical look at their own learning. Because those are fourth-year students, and sometimes they come to the fourth-year courses running, through the 4 years without having actually taken the time to stop and think a little bit about their experience as language learners. So not only as language learners, so identify, for example, personal learning obstacles, develop strategies to overcome them, and reflect on eager issues related to second language acquisition as they pertain to their own learning, but also to reflect on their role as learners in the broader meaning of the term. Help them realize, for example, the extent to which, again, and I know I keep repeating this, they are responsible for the learning. So by going out to the community, they learned so many things, not only language things, but also life lessons, They did realize that learning happens at all times. It does not have to be restricted within the boundaries of the classroom. It can happen in the community, it can happen anywhere, as long as there's an opportunity and a thirst for knowledge. So, for example, my students work that have been working, and the partners are getting more and more every year. Oasis, Centre des Femmes, it's a shelter, it's a center for women victims of abuse, and all those are francophone centers. So that's the whole point, immerse the students into the francophone culture. So they organize workshops for these women, they prepare the International Women's Day, and this year, for the first time, I'm very proud to say that 2 of my students are leading what will be held for the first time in Toronto, Journée Internationale de la Jeune Fille, pas de la femme, de la jeune fille, for the first time. So they are responsible to go to francophone schools, recruit girls, have brainstorming sessions with them, and organize the whole theme of what will be held in next October. Eco Ambassadors of the World is another agency for which they worked. Homes for the elderly, Centre d'accueil Héritage, Camerlodge, Bendale Acres. For Camerlodge and Bendale Acres, I had to search and to look a lot to find their francophone clients. So those are people, usually with dementia or Alzheimer's, and the students, they sang to them, they interacted with them, they spoke to them. Often didn't make any sense what they were saying, but that was not the point. The Centre Francophone de Toronto, I don't know if you're familiar with it, so they organized workshops and special events for new immigrants. They interpreted, especially for appointments at the Toronto Social Services. They did the tax return forms for, again, newcomers to Toronto and to Canada who did not have any money to pay for an accountant, and things like that. So, you're going to ask me, does this experience mean that the learning actually is something? Well, I'm not grading them or I'm not assessing them on the service. I'm assessing the learning that takes part through this service. And experience becomes educated when critical and reflective thought creates new meaning and leads to growth and the ability to take informed actions, according to Bridgel and Hatcher. So what is critical reflection? Simply put, by Ayler, it's the process that helps students connect what they observe and experience in the community with their academic study. So basically, it serves as a bridge between experiences and learning. It allows students to make connections between civic engagement and academic content, and this helps them realize actually the relevance of the learning experience. They're actually doing something with what they've learned. They're serving the community. And it's also important to students because it helps them to learn about themselves, because it engages them in a process where by writing these reflective papers, they're thinking on how they're actually thinking and why are they thinking like this. So it's what allows basically the service experience to become an active and transformative process. So for this course, the critical reflection took many forms, but what I would like to talk about is what involved the peer assessment. So those were bi-weekly papers that students had to write based on specific prompts, specific questions that I was asking for each paper. And they were peer assessing each other. So I needed to prepare them for this. I organized for them workshops given by the Writing Center at the University of Toronto at Scarborough campus on reflective writing. So this was an initiation to the concepts and principles of reflective writing. So this gave them the theoretical framework, okay, what is critical reflection, why do we reflect, models of reflection, from which we maintained the what model. It's the what, so what, now what. So finally, with this, they realized that reflection is not touchy-feely, you know, it's not I'm just expressing my emotions. On the contrary, it involves critical thinking, reasoning, and analytical skills. At first, they were apprehensive. They thought, you know, it would be just them expressing their emotions and their feelings, and they did not necessarily want to do that. And also, they had a hands-on experience. So the person delivering the workshop actually made them work, in English, of course, in types of reflective papers. She gave them, you know, other reflective papers of other students that had to evaluate. So they did have the background when they started doing peer assessment for this course. So in practice, what did it mean? First of all, when I give the subject, students come to class with a draft paper. And then they work in groups of 3. So each student is responsible for the, let's say, assessment, or if you want, the annotating, the commenting of the 2 other papers. So at the end of this exercise, each student leaves with 2 pairs of comments from his or her classmates that they need to take into consideration before submitting the final version. And for the final project, I asked them to submit not only their final version of their work, but also the comments, to attach the comments that the students were making on their paper. So what are they assessing? Be assured they don't give out grades, okay? It's not their responsibility to give A, B, C's to their classmates. But they just give formative feedback that whose goal is to generate, again, a discussion on the topics that we're seeing in class. For example, they're writing, you know, this part is too descriptive. You're not going in depth enough, okay? Or it's not relevant. That's not what the question is asking. You know, it can be as simple as that. Language for this particular exercise, of course, you know, when they're reading, if they want to correct something, you know, accord du participe passé or the subjunctive that we talked about at the beginning, of course they can do it, but it's not the important thing for this exercise. So I provide them with a rubric, a guide, the points that they need to pay attention when they're reading their classmates' paper. So is it coherent? Does it flow? Are the transitions there? Okay. Do the students refer to specific events, even to details, to insights that show when they are in their placement, they're actually attentive of what's going on around them. They are observing what's happening. Are the students' personal views, emotions, feelings about the specific experience not just described, but analyzed, explained, compared maybe with other or previous experiences, put into perspective? Does this reflection provide insights into the students' learning? Are they honest? Honesty is a very important part of reflection. Because what we're judging, what we're assessing, is not the views of the student, but how they come to explain and to analyze these views. So students need to be honest. The benefits for students, well, let's start with my benefit. I get better quality papers at the end, but that's not important. For students, they feel in charge of their learning. Because one of the main goals of this exercise being to provide an opportunity, a space for students to work together, to identify their weaknesses, their personal learning obstacles, from problems of fluency and pronunciation and spontaneity to bigger and more serious hurdles that can impede the learning. For example, this can be personal prejudices and biases. For example, you know, against a specific cultural group that can impede their learning when they're out there in the community. The goal is, again, to try to come up with possible strategies to overcome these obstacles, the now what part of the reflection, if you want. So students are able through this to monitor their progress and to reflect on it. And in doing so, they develop a more mature judgment and feel in charge of their learning. And it's in part this realization of the extent to which they are responsible for the learning that encourages them to further invest themselves in the course. It's nice, when you catch your student speaks French in the corridor, isn't it? I just want to share with you something that a student wrote about reflection. I wasn't a big fan of writing reflections before this course because they always seemed kind of cheesy, but I realized that if you really think about it and then tell the truth and not just write what you think the teacher wants to hear, you can actually learn a lot about your feelings, strengths, or apprehensions about the experience. It is a way to physically put down your thoughts and use them to decide how you will most effectively move forward and keep improving your efforts towards the course. Students also, through this activity, assumed kind of the role of teachers, which gave them an enhanced sense of responsibility and motivation. The course format and this peer assessment allowed them to realize that they too have a role to play as educators of others in the broader sense of the term. They felt that they were not simple spectators or just receivers of information that I, the holder of knowledge, was giving to them. They too could contribute to generating knowledge. And it also gave them a sense of leadership. What I mean by that, students from previous years come as mentors the next year to students of the same course to help them go through the hurdles they went through in a more easy way. A few of the students will continue to have continued and will continue to work for the same organizations long after the course has ended. And again, this year students, for example, who are working for the Journée de la Fille, Journée Internationale de la Fille, it's something they don't have to do, but they will see the project through until October. Finally, this peer assessment is also an effective peer support mechanism. One student writes, discussions about the placements were helpful because it gave me the chance to see how other people were handling their placements. If I had worries about something, chances were someone else had the same worry, and then we could talk it out. Just some of the challenges I met doing this. Time constraints. This peer assessment thing, it's really time consuming. I had 5 papers throughout the semester, and I think a good number to go through in detail with students would be 2, because it's time consuming and it takes away from the material you need to cover, because we have material to cover as well. Sometimes the quality of the first draft was not ideal, so students had not really put a serious effort into the first try. And then again, there are the differences of level among students. Some are very, very good. Some are not as good. They don't have the same depth of thought. So there is a challenge there, but I try to circumvent it by, allowing them to change groups throughout the semester when they're doing this exercise. Was it worth it? I believe that it's definitely worth investing the time and the energy and the effort to design tools that help students to take their motivation a step further, even if it's only a small step towards autonomy and self-accountability for the learning. I think it's definitely worth it. We can only, plant the seeds for students to become, to gain a thirst for knowledge. And as my grandfather said, I cannot teach anybody anything. I can only make them think. Thank you.